Okay, we're up and running. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our presentation. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Dr. James Broomall, an Associate Professor of History at Shepherd University, as well as the Director of the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. I'm joined this evening by some colleagues and friends from Shepherd, which is an incredibly nice treat. And I will introduce them, if I may, in alphabetical order. And so, at least on my screen, just below me to the left is Dr. Ben Bankhurst, who is now an Associate Professor of History, newly minted. So we offer Ben a hearty congratulations. Ben is an expert on Appalachia, the broader Atlantic world, a scholar of migratory patterns, as well as sort of religious ideology and thought. But as a side hobby, he happens to be a banjo player. And so this evening, while he will certainly be our historian expert in residence, he's also going to play some music for us. So we're extraordinarily excited and fortunate to have him joining us. Below me on at least my screen is Rachael Meads. And Rachael wears many hats at Shepherd. So she not only teaches in the App Studies program, where she teaches courses on Appalachian culture, as well as Appalachian music and ethnomusicology, which is why she's here tonight. But she is also the Assistant Director of Student Engagement. And she is an activist, she's a writer, she's a scholar, an author. And so we're extraordinarily excited to have Rachael here, who's going to be providing some context for us. And then to my side is Mr. Tim Ware. And Tim is the administrative assistant at the Civil War Center at Shepherd. He has a deep background in public history, having worked most recently at Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park. He has also worked at Fort Frederick, and while not doing the sundry responsibilities for which he's responsible at the center, he is a violin and fiddle player, and I guess I'll use those terms interchangeably. And so he has been playing the instrument for a very long time, and again will appear this evening before us as a player. Now, our two player guests, aren't obviously professional musicians, nor is the equipment that we have as perfectly well suited perhaps as it might otherwise be. But I think we worked out the kinks and the sounds. Quality should be rather good. I'll try to monitor it throughout the program. But what we're going to be doing tonight is working through several centuries of what is sometimes referred to as folk music. We're going to be focusing in some instances very regionally on the Shenandoah Valley, on Appalachia more broadly. In other cases, will be a bit more expansive. And we're extraordinarily interested in kind of cross-cultural exchanges, how these instruments in some ways have been very much informed by the contact of different peoples. And really, Rachael is in many ways going to sort of shape this conversation, provide a lot of the necessary context. I think this evening, I'm literally going to kind of like lean back and listen to the music and just enjoy. But with that, welcome to our audience. As you're tuning in, feel free to pose any comments or questions that you might have. I see our audience is growing in numbers here, so welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. And with that, I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and turn it over to Rachael, who's going to provide the introductory context for our conversation. And as necessary, I have some images that might help guide it. And then from there, we're going to turn it over to our players. They're going to offer some tunes, and then we're going to bring it back to Rachael. And she, in turn, is going to close us out with some broad remarks. So is that fair game plan? Okay. I think I got everything right. Okay.
That sounds great.
Okay, so with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Rachael.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks for inviting us to come here and do this together, to be part of this panel together. And I know one of the disappointments for Ben and Tim, who are our guest musicians tonight, is that there is no way for them to play together. Ideally, they wanted to play together, but on Zoom, it presents some special challenges. So following up what Jim just said, please be gentle and kind. Our musicians, this is not their professional gig. Both of them do this because they love the music. This was their idea. which I think they had to remind themselves of that earlier today. This was our idea, wasn't it? But they really just want to share the music that they love and the instruments that they love and tell you a little bit about where their influences come from. And so I'm here to share a little bit of context because I'm going to tell you a little bit about the instruments, and we're going to talk about where they come from and what their history is. And then I'm going to let these folks who are the stars of the show do a little bit of playing, and we're going to deconstruct some of the songs that they're going to play as well. So as Jim said, my name is Rachael Meads, and I teach here at Shepherd. I teach an ethnomusicology class, so if you ever get excited and you want to take an Appalachian Studies class, you are more than welcome to come join us and deep dive into Appalachian music and the music of the region because we cover a lot about West Virginia specifically because it's the one state that's 100% within the boundaries geographically of Appalachia. But looking at ethnomusicology, it's really just a lens for looking at the culture and the history of people and the stories of people. And the music that you're going to hear tonight is coming from a tradition that is very prevalent in Virginia and West Virginia, that is mostly coming from an oral tradition. And when I say oral tradition, meaning that most of this music was not learned through notation. It wasn't learned through people looking at a sheet music or going to someone and sort of having formal instruction. The way that the bulk of old time and traditional music in Appalachia has been passed down is ear to ear, knee to knee, we call it, where people sit down with someone else playing and they listen. You sit at the feet and you listen, or it's just part of your everyday lived experience. And so you learn it by ear and you practice, and it's trial and error, and that's part of it. Today, people are still learning that way. My daughter, who plays banjo, is learning through YouTube and listening to what other players are doing, and then grabbing her banjo and trying to recreate what she's hearing from other players who she really likes. And that tradition, even though we have all this technology at our fingertips, even though we have all of the wonders of modern life in front of us, it's not all that different. I mean, maybe we're not in the same room doing the knee to knee, but the way she's learning is not that different than the way someone would have learned, 200 years ago from someone else. So just kind of keeping it in that context. So it's an oral tradition. We're learning it by ear generally. Eventually, people come through and try to capture those tunes and sort of codify them, put them into some sort of a framework so that other people who do read music can learn them. And more importantly, I think because people wanted to commercialize the music and find a way to do that, and through broadsides and selling music and royalties, the Carter family later become experts at this as we move into early country music because they're going back and looking at really old tunes and putting them in a framework and a structure so that they can be copyrighted and then sold, and they can have royalties and they can make money, for this music. But I want to sort of dispel a couple stereotypes off the top. One of them is that all music from this region is incredibly homogenous. Whenever people come into this region for the first time and they start to learn about it, a lot of people are really drawn by the Celtic roots of the music, and they're really attracted to that, and they are drawn to that. And 100% there is a Celtic strain and thread throughout Appalachian music and the music of West Virginia and Virginia that's so strong, and it's so important and prevalent, but it is not the only one. So I just want to dispel the homogeny myth and say we are not one thing, and we're not all. People would ask, like, so is it Scottish music or Irish music? We're so much broader than that. There's so much more going on here. And if people take anything away from a study of Appalachia at Shepherd, it's that I want them to understand the great, rich, diverse, multicultural tapestry that is our region. So that's part of the great thing about this music and this culture that I love so much is the multiplicity of voices and where people come from. So, for example, Tim, you want to hold up your instrument for a minute? So Tim's got a fiddle here, also known as a violin. Sometimes it's just the neck and the setup. You can play violin or fiddle on the same instrument. It doesn't mean that you have to have a totally different instrument. Tunings may change, but that's pretty much the same instrument, right? And so where that instrument's coming from, people who are immigrants, thank you, Tim, are bringing it with them to America when they come to settle here. Because of course, our first people who were here, we had Native people who were already here. Our Native Americans were here from the get-go, and they had rich musical traditions. They had instruments, they had really complex and rich song traditions and storytelling traditions. So you had Native people who were here. You have settlers, your earliest settlers that are coming over. So you do get a lot of people coming from the British Isles. And when they come, they bring with them their instruments, their songs, their stories. And then the instrument that Ben has, you want to show him what you've got there? Ben's got a banjo, and the origins of the banjo are not at all coming from the British Isles, not at all. So people often think of the banjo as a very white instrument, that somehow they assume that that's the history of it, but that's because of throughout history we've sort of forgotten where it came from. So the banjo's origin is very much in Africa. It's an African instrument. So Jim's going to pull up a couple images that I think are really significant. This one, the first image he's showing you, this is the first image that we have record of painting of a banjo in the United States. And this image itself, whenever you look at it, you can see the instrument on the right-hand side, that it's definitely a banjo, right? And it's from the origins of another instrument that often was called the banjar in early writing, in the first kind of writing of the settlers. People were trying to describe what this was. This instrument has a direct antecedent in Africa. It's a West African instrument. It was used as a gourd on the bottom with the skin over the top, and it's strung. The versions in Africa have multiple levels, numbers of strings, it varies. And some of them, depending on where you are used in a griot style and a griot tradition in storytelling, and played similarly to what they're played as a plucked string instrument, but also used as a percussive instrument because it has that gourd bottom that's a drum head, right? So it does make that drum noise. And Ben's does the same thing. If he wants to hit on the top head of his banjo, it can be a drum and have a drum effect as well. So we have an instrument that is clearly, coming from Africa, and there are records that this was actually they were found in slave ships that they came over during the Middle Passage. So this is something that the instrument itself, once it gets to the United States, takes on a whole new identity. Because, of course, enslaved people were not allowed to play drums because they were considered too dangerous, that drums could be used to signal and communicate between people in different areas, and that was considered to be a potential for uprising. So while drums were not allowed, banjos were seen as innocuous and not weapon-like, and so they were allowed to exist. And as they are made here with the materials that are available to people here in the United States, they grow into their own very unique, individual, super American instrument. So the banjo was really the first new America instrument, the first one. And despite popular belief systems, it was not invented by the Sweeneys, who were affiliated with minstrelsy. Absolutely not. It has existed way before that. So we've got records of it. We know that that's true. So you have this African instrument, and it meets up with Native American music and the shuffle stomp dance styles. And so all of this starts to kind of form its own blend of music in the New World. And when you add that to the Celtic traditions and the things that were being brought from the British Isles, and then all of these diverse immigrant traditions that also flow into the region. So you have German traditions that we are very aware of here in Shepherdstown. You have lots of different cultural traditions, Eastern Europeans and Italians, and people traveling into the region in different waves of immigration. And that really influences our music and how we communicate with one another. So I think that was my big thing is I wanted you to understand that this is a meeting and a mixing of cultures. Things come together here and clash and combine and meet, and suddenly there's a dialogue between these different musical styles, and they blend into something that's completely uniquely its own and is a beautiful kind of American musical tradition. So here is another image. I think this is a great one. Music, just remembering that context as well from the image that Jim just put up. Music is used as entertainment in the home. It's used as a way to entertain yourself and others, and eventually for dances and community gatherings. And it's used in the Black community, the white community, the immigrant community. And you can see in these images, he's got a couple of other really good ones like this one, that there is multiculturalism present in the art. This isn't something that's happening in a completely single dimensioned environment. So we've got people of different traditions that are mixing and really influencing in dialogue with music with one another. Some of them in a more oppressed role, clearly, because slaves were often asked to perform for dances and to create the music as servants or slaves. And so we have to kind of keep that in the back of our head too. But I'd like to give Tim an opportunity, I think, to play a tune or two. And I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about it because part of the joy of this music is that you learn it from a particular source. And often when you learn it from that source, you're the person who then kind of says, "Oh, I got it from this person who learned it from this person," and that it's in this style. So I'm going to let each of them sort of ask them to introduce where they learned it and what the tune is. And then we can talk a little bit more about it as well.
Okay, so the first song I'm going to play is called Barbara Allen, or sometimes referenced as Barbara Allen's Cruelty, or The Young Man's Tragedy. I learned it reading sheet music, but this is one of those songs that's passed down, as Rachel said, as an oral tradition. Charles Seeger at some point did a study on just the song, and there's like 250 different variations throughout the country. So it's a very popular song. It's passed down. And I learned it from, well, I heard about it, I should say, from one of my friends who I used to work with, was from Great Britain, which is where this song comes from. So that it's just that same tune over and over again. There's quite a few verses to the song if you look up the lyrics. And it's a pretty sorrowful song if you read the lyrics, because it's about a young man who basically proclaims his love for this woman named Barbara Allen. And he sends a messenger off because he's on his deathbed. And Barbara Allen agrees to come see him, but she takes her good old time getting there. She walks really slow. And when she does arrive, she basically puts him off and leaves him to die. And when she hears the bells ringing in the local town, she knows that this young man has died, and the grief over the way she treated him causes her to eventually herself die out of grief. And then that's like the first version. It was published in 1690 on Broadside. But again, there's different variations, and the gist of it, one of the variations is the young man is buried, and he has a rose bush on his grave. And then the woman is buried right next to him, Barbara Allen, and she has a briar bush on her grave. And as these plants grow, they become intertwined. So they kind of become an eternal couple. Whereas in life, she put him off and didn't really care much for how he felt.
And what's so great is that that tune also is a creation story, right? It's an origin story. So just like many cultures around the world have those stories about like how did this happen? How did the tiger get its stripes? It's the story of how did the rose get its thorns? And I love that one. My students love it too. And Tim's right. As far as English speaking balladry and tunes, this would have been a sung ballad before it was a played ballad. And it does have a ton of verses. The Library of Congress has multiple records with multiple sides of records, like 4 sides of various variants of Barbara Allen, just on that LP, long playing LP set that I remember having when I first started studying the music. And I was just in wonder and awe. I was like, oh, look at all these versions. And now that we have digital libraries, there are thousands of versions that you can study and look at, explore what sort of communities looked at it differently. It's pretty remarkable. So that's one of our oldest tunes. We have a reference in 1666 to that particular tune. So it's old. So you think like Shakespeare would have heard that tune. Shakespeare would have known that tune. You know, it's pretty remarkable. So and it's still around. It's probably one of the most well-known ballads, British Isles ballads, and it's very well known here in the United States as well. So thank you for playing that one. That's a
Yeah,
good place to start. It's probably the oldest one you could pick. So great example of British Isles sort of style. What would you like to do next, Tim?
so I'm going to play. It's a Scottish folk song. It's called Loch Lomond or Loch Lomond. It's about. It comes about after the Jacobite Rebellion. It's 1740, 1745, 46, and it's from the perspective of a prisoner who's about to be executed for taking part in this rebellion. And he's telling his. It's there's mixed tradition says one, either he's telling his lover who's traveled from Scotland that he won't see her anymore, and he'll take the low road, which is his grave, back to Scotland, and she'll take the high road um, to travel to Loch Lomond, which will then, in spirit, he'll be there with her. So it's either him telling his lover that he'll never see her again, or his friend that's with him who's being spared. So here goes. Right. So again, a little rusty, as I said. As they said, I'm not a professional. But yeah, that's the gist of that song. It's a very mournful song, and I mean, Rachel might know a little bit more about it than I do, but I'm not sure if if this is a big song in colonial America. But it's almost like the Scottish national anthem. It's a very popular Scottish song. Um, so yeah, Rachel, do you have anything to add to that?
Absolutely. And it is definitely based on this poem and it's mournful and sad and you can hear it even in the way that Tim plays it, like it's got that plaintive sadness and it tells a story. And these story songs, the ballads and the story songs, really are significant because you're going to see them a lot in the music that's coming in from the British Isles because it's a way of preserving history. It's a way of remembering this song, particularly because it deals directly with history and real historic events and feelings and people. So I think the other thing I wanted to point out about that when you play it is that when people came over and they came over the ocean and traveling, there's very little room. There are instruments that would have existed that people would have wanted to bring with them, but not everything is portable, right? Not everything is convenient to bring with you when you travel to a new world. And the fiddle is probably one of the most portable, lightweight, easy to carry on your back, easy to strap somewhere and to put it in a small compartment and to bring it out. So if you don't have much room and you're traveling, it's an instrument that could go with you. So you do see a lot of people bringing the fiddle over with them for that reason as well. And listening to that tune, I always hear bagpipes. When I hear it played on fiddle, I also hear bagpipe because you know that that tune is also played as a pipe tune. And the sound of fiddle played in, particularly in Appalachia, I think a lot of the times does echo that pipe sound. A lot of the tunings are matched. You get a lot of tunes that are sort of built around that drone sound with a drone note that's always going sort of underneath of it. And that ties to that pipe, that pipe sound to me. So when I hear the fiddle, I always also hear kind of like a harmony part in my head that's got this like pipe behind you. Not that everybody's a pipe fan, but
Mhm.
it's there.
Yeah, and that song's also used as the traditional, like a traditional Irish song, "Red is the Rose," if you've ever heard that one. So it's the same tune. I think they come about the same time, roughly, if the tradition's correct. So then the last song I have for you it's a very popular one. It's called "The Girl I Left Behind," or "The Girl I Left Behind Me," and it dates from reportedly as early as 1650, but it's definitely published in Dublin, Ireland, in 1791 on the broadside. It becomes really popular in Great Britain and the American colonies before it's published, and it becomes even more popular with the American Army after the War of 1812, and remains so through well into the 20th century. And it's a little bit more happier, it's a little bit more jauntier than the last two. So here we go. Yeah, it's a little bit more jauntier. It's a little bit more happier than the sad songs I've just played.
And it should be because it's meant to be a dance tune. It's meant to be a folk song that's got it, that one has roots way back to the Elizabethan era. And it's a dancing song and it's a jaunting song. And then later on it becomes also a marching song. So if you are in a regiment and you are marching in colonial America, you might have been marching to that very tune because it worked with the step well, but it really was a dance tune. And it's got, lots and lots of old roots, but you'll still hear that one today as well. Anything you want to add about that one particularly?
Not that it comes to mind. Is there something else that you have
The
that I'm
one thing I
forgetting?
wanted to no, the one thing I just was thinking about that with all three of these tunes, you can also see versions of them. You brought up, Tim, that in Scotland, Loch Lomond might be one thing, and in Ireland, it might be something else. That happens throughout all of these tunes regionally, no matter where you are. If you're in certain communities, whether it's in Great Britain or whether it's in Wales or here in East Tennessee versus Southwest Virginia, you're going to get this tune that really sounds similar and that has a root, like a root that's connected, but that everyone sort of localizes, and that you learn it because of that oral tradition where you're learning it ear to ear, one person to another person. Depending on who you're hearing it with and learning it from, I think Ben called it misremembering a little bit, that you sometimes have variations that come because one person's style might be slightly different, and it leads to variants that come into existence. So you're going to hear a million versions of a song that sounds like another song, and you'll say, well, is this one or that one? And it really is all in the playing, but they may have a similar root that they're coming from. Um, Ben, do you want to step onto the stage for a minute? I really hate that I can't have you all play together because I feel like this is the ultimate, like banjo and fiddle are the West Virginia original string band. I mean, the voice is the instrument that, everybody has and uses all the time. But beyond that, these two instruments are probably the most core and central to all string band music in Appalachia and in early America. They're so important.
Well, and if I may, Rachel,
Go right ahead.
I think that this will be a taste that we will do a performance at some point at the center. Maybe we'll live stream it so we can have that online experience, that online audience. But we will have an opportunity at some point for these two fine players to work together. And just again, to you all in our audience, thank you very much for joining us thus far. Thank you for Rachel's incredible commentary. I feel like it's a very entertaining evening for me. I'm just sitting back and listening to all this brilliance. And for Tim's fiddle playing. And one of the things that I'll say before we turn it to Ben, I think is so interesting, as a historian, I spend most of my time immersed in sort of primary source materials, secondary source materials. And there's this real gulf that exists between the past and the present in those mediums. Music transports you immediately. And so, we've gone through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and there's this amazing connectivity that I think just always is what draws me in so much to music. And it's why I'm so, I think, enthralled by it. And so it's just this connective thread that, as Rachel said, you can sort of transport yourself back to, be it a fiddle hall, or a tavern of the 18th century, and then farther back you can go across the Atlantic Ocean, and it just has this amazing quality about it that's very transcendent. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Rachel and my colleague, and again, newly minted associate professor, Dr. Ben Bankhurst.
All right, well,
Absolutely. There's nothing like following up the day before your banjo debut with promotion and your birthday. So, yeah, I think this is a great time to be here with you. So, what are you going to play for us?
well, thank you very much. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Tim, for that. Jim said that we hope these two fine players get together. I think he was talking about Tim, not so much on this side of things. Also, Tim ended his set there with a jaunty song, a happy song. You're not going to get any of that from me. There's going to be no happy songs from here on out. It's just constant misery. So I'm going to start off with a song that was requested by one of my children. So this is for Alex, and it's a song I wanted to start with, not necessarily because I have much of a story about it, but because I think it really, at least in the way I try to play it, it's kind of indicative of a facet of clawhammer banjo playing that Rachel had alluded to, which is the percussive nature of it. So I'll try to play it to emphasize that aspect of the instrument. I should warn everybody, I really have no rhythm whatsoever, so this could be pretty painful. But anyway, this is for Alex, and it's Cluck Old Hen. And I'll start again. That was just a little taster of Cluck Old Hen. Before I turn it over to Rachel, I kind of sprung that on you, Rachel. I don't think we talked about doing it.
I was ready. You told me. This has
okay,
been
good.
requested.
Yeah, so if you, I'll just leave it over to you then.
So, well, I just wanted to hear what you were going to say about it, and then I'll take it over. But what were you going to say, Ben?
Oh, I was just gonna say about the tuning. This is a modal tuning, sometimes referred to as the sawmill tuning, and perhaps we'll go into that in a little bit.
I am so glad you brought that up, because that is one of the things that I was going to say,
Okay.
is that one of the reasons why I love my favorite tunes that are banjo tunes, I am a fan of the modal tuning, which is very kind of dark and haunting and a little bit sad, and it speaks of the banjo to me. I don't know. Those are the ones that resonate the most with me. But Cluck Old Hen is the earliest version that I think we have of this one is from 1886, is the earliest recorded version of it, but it probably was out there before that. And there's some debate about where it came from. In recordings, our first recording, I think, was Fiddlin' John Carson that we've got, that was the first person to record it. But that's a tune that there was a lot of debate about, because we think that that is of African American origin, that that would have been a tune that would have come from the Black community. And there are verses, there are words to those. I see why it was requested, because some of the words are funny, and this is a good example of a song where the story is Cluck Old Hen, because the hen is going to eventually be dinner, right? And so you get different versions of people adding on to it over time. And even recently I heard a version of Cluck Old Hen that referenced, like, long cooking, what are they called, the Instapots. There was an Instapot version. So these songs are not done. They are not dead. They're not gone. They are still very much alive and living. And I love studying the history of them, because it tells us the history of us. The more we study these tunes, the more we understand our own development as people and as cultures, and how we've grown in America. So it's just a really good lens to use to look at it. But I love that particular tune, and I'm glad your kids requested it.
Yeah, great. So Rachel had asked us to kind of tell perhaps a personal story behind why we chose some of these songs. And my next song is Newcastle, or sometimes known as Texas. And I should say that my connection to the banjo is fairly new, and I'm actually interested in the music to escape academia in a weird way, and I'm excited about the murkiness of some of the origins and the messiness of it, which I know is problematic in some respects, but perhaps we could talk about that later. Though there's some family connections to the instrument, those have been severed by a generation. So when I decided to take it up, I did it when I was a graduate student in London, in the UK. So part of it was sort of a homesickness and nostalgia, which is perhaps a romanticized homesickness, right? Where I'm trying to, reconnect with America through an instrument that is kind of quintessentially American in a respect. And I learned how to play it from a man named Simon Watson, who was a Quaker, who had studied under the famed Pocahontas County player, Dwight Diller, who himself had sat at the knees, as you had indicated earlier, of the famous Hammonds family. So some of the tunes that I learned through Watson had a West Virginia connection, going back to the Hammonds, twice removed, I suppose. One of the songs I learned when I was learning with Simon was this song Newcastle, and I just love it, and so does my daughter, who requested it. So this is for Ellie, and this is Newcastle or Texas, as played by Dwight Diller, who played it better.
That was great. That was wonderful. So he's so modest. He says, "I'm not going to play this well. You played that wonderfully. That was great." And I love the sound of it because that is a particularly, to me, that sounds particularly West Virginian to me. And the song itself, Newcastle, is a reference. Alan Jabor recorded this when he was recording Henry Reed, and it is collected in the Henry Reed collection in the Library of Congress. Alan Jabor, if you aren't familiar, was a folklorist. His father was also a folklorist, and they collected a ton of American music, really dug into looking at American music. And thank goodness for these folklorists who went everywhere with little early primitive recording devices and their little microphones and tried to record absolutely everything they could and learn as many of these tunes as they possibly could. And Alan Jabor was great because he did not look for sort of the high culture tunes. A lot of people went looking for um, and if you really want a good lecture on this, this is a Dr. Bankhurst thing. A lot of people were looking for the ballads and trying to song catch throughout Appalachia, looking for British Isles ballads, and they certainly found them. You know, North Carolina and Virginia and into West Virginia, there was pockets of amazingly preserved British Isles culture. And balladry that people went looking for, but that was sort of prized as like more refined, more more interesting to folklorists, and there was a whole revival of interest in it. But Alan Jabor was one of the folks who said, you know what, there's a lot of other stuff out here that we're not documenting that's really important. And so he went looking for tunes that were kind of off the beaten track, and a lot of those lend to us in American history now having recordings of Lead Belly and these recordings made in prisons exploring places where no one was interested in what was happening there. And there's this rich history of African American music that is preserved because a few folklorists said, you know what, we need to record this stuff. This is really important, and it's really influential, and we're ignoring it. The same thing for a lot of the mountain music, because a lot of those early folklorists and song catchers were not interested in music like this tune, because they considered it too not pure enough. They considered it too mixed. It had been influenced by lots of different cultural traditions. The rhythm of it is influenced by definitely Cherokee rhythm and Native American sort of patterns in music. And then you've got folks that are coming in and pulling other traditions. There's definitely bluesy notes in there that come from the black banjo tradition. So this particular tune I love because the way you play it reminds me, probably because you're learning it from the sources that it's coming from the Hammonds family. So the Hammonds family, if you're not familiar with them, they are kind of one of the most significant musical families in West Virginia history, because the Library of Congress, thanks to Dwight Diller, who is an absolute banjo legend in West Virginia and old time music, Dwight Diller really brought them to the attention, brought this family in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, to the attention of the Library of Congress. And thanks to him and his relationship with that family, and Dwight will tell you, like, he was saved by them as a family. Like, he was a broken young man, and that this family really took him in and mentored him and taught him music and taught him about life and storytelling and value and all of these things. So we have this amazing iconic Library of Congress recording of the Hammonds family that becomes so significant in ethnomusicology, because the way that it's structured is they didn't just come in and capture tunes. You get to know this family and their history. There's a brilliant, like, pages and pages that go with it in the liner notes in the beginning of where did the family come from? Where did they migrate from? They were farther south. They moved northward and eventually settled in Pocahontas County because they're trying to get away from outside influences of people that are causing ruckus and are tearing up the land and are in the middle of a civil war, and they don't want to be involved. They're like, we don't want to be part of this. So they migrate farther and farther away and settle in Pocahontas County and are doing farming and really are subsistence living and trading with their neighbors, and they're living off the land. But their tunes are so important because a lot of them are very unique to their community and to them as a family. And you can hear, like, really amazingly, I think, these influences of regionalism, of how regional culture influences a music through the Hammonds family. So I highly recommend you can go onto the Library of Congress site, you can pull up the Hammonds family, and it's Hammons. There's no D on there. So if you're looking for it, there's no D. It's just Hammonds, family of West Virginia. And the Hammonds family collection is great. The Hammonds also had fiddlers in their family. Eden Hammonds was a fantastic fiddler and a fiddle champ at fiddle competitions. When music starts to become fiddle competitions and things start to become a really big deal in the culture, because you would see musicians come in, and one of the things Ben mentioned is that these often were sort of used as political events, whether on election day or for electioneering, trying to bring in, and get the voters in to vote for you by having these fiddle contests or bringing in these really great fiddlers. The shame of it all is that those fiddle contests only allowed white contestants, when some of the best fiddlers that we had out there were black fiddlers in the black tradition. So the string band tradition is, fiddle and banjo, and that's, it's a black tradition as well as a white tradition. And it's a shame that we didn't get to get the recordings from those great fiddlers as well, because there are very few of them, very few and far between. But one of the things that I wanted to make sure I pointed out is that is now not entirely lost, because the scholarship recently is phenomenal about old time traditions in music, particularly around black banjo traditions and the black string band. And thanks to groups like the Carolina Chocolate Drops and now Our Native Daughters, if you have not checked out Our Native Daughters, go watch it. Watch it tonight, watch it tomorrow. You can watch it for free on YouTube. They have this amazing concert. Our Native Daughters, Smithsonian put it out with country music television. So CMT and the Smithsonian, Google it. It'll come up. This concert is amazing. These four, Rhiannon Giddens and Layla McCall and Amethyst Kia, they get together and do the four really strong black women reclaiming the music of the black string band tradition, but also of women. And it is unbelievably powerful. They call on the history of the music, and they thought they were going to just do an album that's historic, and instead they did an album of new music that speaks to their history. And it is powerful stuff. And there's a great panel that they did last week of just talking about it out there through the wonders of technology. You can check it all out. But yeah, powerful stuff. So thank you so much for that one because I love that tune. And you played it fabulously, Ben.
Oh, well, thank you.
What else do you want to share for us? You've got another one, I think, in there.
Oh yes, just one last one, and one of the reasons I wanted to play this is it's difficult, but it's also one that I think I was talking about one of the reasons I was attracted to the music in the first place is kind of the murkiness of a lot of the origins, and this one is again it's another Hammonds family song translated through, well, to me anyway, through the cassette tapes of Dwight Diller from the 90s. And there's two versions that I know from Diller, from those instructional tapes. There's one version from his Just Banjo 94, and then there's his Just Banjo 98, which is a completely different version, which is a lot simpler. I later found out that one of the reasons he went with the simpler version later on is because he's kind of annoyed at some of the flourishes that Ed and Hammonds had put in the original fiddle recording of it, and he wanted to get back to sort of a more, get back to the music as it would have been played, within the household and within the community. So I'll play the simpler version. I'm also playing it in A. It would have been played in G modal, but I don't want to mess around with the tuning here. And when I say it's kind of the murky origins of it, I mean, what does it mean, the Falls of Richmond? It's also known as the Fall of Richmond. And so there's a possibility that this goes back to the Civil War, and is an attempt to document the fall of Richmond in 1865. It's also just there's a possibility that it refers to the falls in the River James near Richmond. It could also refer to a place on the New River, Sansett Falls, which was at one point named Richmond Falls. So who knows? Anyway, here we go.
That was great.
Thank you.
That was great. And I know there's a lot of debate in the old time folk music revival community about that tune and its origins because people, again, regionalism, people hear it and it travels from one place to another. But I think that the root, at least as far as I've been able to find out, it's always falls, which is with an S, but fall, a lot of people who are Civil War players who learned this tune assumed, well, it's the fall of Richmond, right? That it must be a Civil War tune. And really, it kind of predates that. It's 1848, and it's Hammonds family of West Virginia that the origin, I think, was Uncle Pete. They called him Uncle Pete of the Hammonds family, and that's who they attributed the tune to. And according to them, it was really, the title was about the waterfalls or the rapids that are on the James River at Richmond, that you get these little bunches of waterfalls there. And then it sounded like the movement of the river, that it was trickling over the rocks and moving away, like, flowing, because it's kind of a quick, it's got a quick pace to it and a movement. So in my head, that's how I always hear it now. But there's a lot of debate about that because a lot of people who learned it later are like, oh, it's got to be like the Fall of Richmond. This has got to be about that. And then there was someone else who said that they felt like it had another origin. I can't remember now. That there are a million different variants, but that's a pretty popular one. And the Hammonds family, I think, were such a significant repository. I realized this not, I grew up in West Virginia hearing Hammond's family tunes from, I was in Glenville. I grew up in Glenville, West Virginia. So home of the West Virginia State Folk Festival. It's a place that like, this is the music I grew up hearing. And I took it for granted and I really didn't appreciate it because it was sort of like, it was just there in the ether. And it took until I was away from it before I started to recognize its value. Because I think when we're young and we're listening to Michael Jackson and we're, Prince fans, we just want to be like somewhere else that seems more cultured and more sophisticated and cooler and hipper. And, it took until later when I sort of came back to it to recognize the richness of these traditions. And the Hammonds family, I remember going on a trip funded like a cultural exchange program to Veracruz, Mexico, funded by the Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation, which was like one of the best gifts I've ever had in my whole life to get to go to Veracruz and study son jarocho music, which is their folk music. And I'm meeting these son jarocho musicians, and son jarocho is like La Bamba, right? Like la 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 bamba. Like that's son jarocho in its more up-to-date 1950s version. But it has a long tradition that goes through, the 1800s and when I met these son jarocho musicians and I said where I was from, they looked at me and they said, "You're from West Virginia? Hammond's family. You know the Hammond's family? Because they have a really strong fiddle tradition in Mexican folk music as well. And no matter where you go around the world, if you ask, the guys from Old Crow Medicine Show or, Ben Townsend or people who've been traveled all over the world, they'll tell you like the Hammonds family comes up again and again in Japan, in, the British Isles, because that sound, and it was so well documented, is so significant. And because the Hammonds had lived in such a kind of isolated spot, they held on to these musical traditions that were incredibly rich and valuable, but they had less sort of change. Although I would argue they were not completely culturally isolated and they did have influence. Like you hear like bluesiness, you hear those pieces in their music as well. So I love that. Ben, do you have one more for us? Do you have any others you want to share?
Oh, I wouldn't put you all through that. Thanks. So.
Wonderful. So again, to our audience, Rachel's been kind enough to provide 2 links, which I in turn have posted, that will give some further context to some of the information that she discussed this evening. Links to the Library of Congress, which is just such an incredible resource. And again, Our Native Daughters, I did a quick Google search while you all were speaking, and indeed it comes right up. To our audience this evening, thank you. There was a lot of approbation for our players, and so your talents have been recognized. And again, I think, at some point we will definitely try to figure out a way to do this at the center, and then again, maybe perhaps to live stream. Rachel, that was fantastic commentary. And this was an embarrassing event for me because I literally did nothing. So
Thanks
that
so
was good.
much.
You just absolutely crushed it. And this was Tim's brainchild. So Tim has been the center now for 3+ months, right?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. And so this event was very much his idea. And so I appreciate his impetus behind creating this. And then to my colleagues, Tim included, of course, thank you for your time. I mean, I know, again, we're at the end of the week, everyone's kind of exhausted. And so I really appreciate it. This was actually like a really kind of nice, calm, fun, entertaining evening. As always, please continue to follow us on social media. We'll continue to do probably every 2 to 3 weeks, I think, is our pace currently. Some sort of program, be it culture, be it history based. We'll have something else coming up toward the end of March that we'll announce, and then we have a couple programs projected from April through the summer. Does anyone have any sort of closing remarks before we are concluded for the evening?
Thanks to our players for doing such a great job, and thanks for inviting us to talk about this. And you know that we're just touching the tip of the iceberg, so please feel free to delve more. We're just trying to start your interest, but if you have more interest in it, reach out. We'd love to have questions, and we would love to share more, but delve into some of those recordings because there's great stuff there and so much more.
And take Rachel's Appalachian culture and music classes.
Okay. With that, then I'll thank again our players. Deeply appreciate that. It was immensely entertaining. And to Rachel, thank you very much for your insightful commentary. That's phenomenal. And again, thank you to you all. There's one quick question here. Our Native Daughters was the second group that was mentioned, and then the links again will get you back to the Library of Congress. And so with that, I think we'll go ahead and say good evening to everyone and wish everyone good health, and wish everyone well. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at our next program. So with that, I will close this out.